Okay, welcome to session number 5 of our online series on the 22 presidential and parliamentary elections in Brazil. Still last year, we started off with a session on the dynamics of government and the electoral process and on the long-term trend in political representation. Then we moved on to topics like feminism and gender under Bolsonaro and on the relationship between government and Congress. But while our previous sessions focused on the Bolsonaro government itself and on the elections, since then the dynamics of Brazilian politics presented us with new facts, and we were increasingly challenged because we had to bridge the gap between our original focus on the past government and, on the other side, the interpretation of what happened after Bolsonaro's electoral defeat at the polls. So this will be not any different in today's session. But before we enter our session proper, I would like to remind you that we are recording this session. The previous sessions are available at the Institute's YouTube channel. So the Institut Ibero-Americano in Berlin. And in addition, I would also announce that we are like to announce that we are preparing another edited volume on this series of sessions where our panelists will present their results after the dust settles, hopefully in a couple of weeks. And another announcement is obviously that our online conference is being held in collaboration between the Ibero-American Institute in Berlin and the Department of Political Science of USP University. And today also we are joined by colleagues and students of the International Political Science Association's Summer School on Methods in Political Science, which is held right now at Sao Paulo University. The program has been put together by Peter Birli, the scientific director of the EIE, and me, Bruno Speck, political scientists at USP. And now we're entering our session proper, which focuses on the relationship between the judiciary and politics, which has been a topic debated for many years. During the Bolsonaro presidency, the relationship became increasingly conflictual, specifically the role of the Supreme Court with its attributions of reviewing legislative and administrative acts is the object of critical analysis by political actors and by academics for some time. So the question is, what are the challenges of Brazilian institutional arrangements and the way in which the judiciary actors fulfilled their attributions during the Bolsonaro government and obviously in the past few weeks since his electoral defeat. So without further ado, I would like to, sorry, I still have to present our colleagues. So we'll have 3 colleagues doing presentations. Luciano Daros is an assistant professor in political science at the Federal University in Santa Catarina, Brazil. He has done his PhD in political science at the University of Illinois, Chicago, and his research focuses on comparative judicial politics and has been published in several journals. And recently he published, together with Matthew Taylor, the volume Brazilian Politics on Trial, Corruption and Reform Under Democracy. Manuel Gerke is a research fellow at the Center of Elections, Democracy, Accountability and Representation at the University of Birmingham, England. He joins us from there today. He has received his PhD in political science also from the University of California, Los Angeles. And his research also focuses on corruption, contemporary threats to democracy, the role of money in politics, and political economy of environmental degradation. And finally, Conrado Hübner Mendes is a professor of constitutional law at the Faculty of Law at the University of Sao Paulo. He holds a PhD in law from the University of Edinburgh, His book, Constitutional Courts and Deliberative Democracy, has received the prestigious prize Victor Nunes Leal from the Brazilian Association of Political Science. Among other things, he was a scientist ambassador for the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation from 14 to 2020. And he's a member of the Science Research and Freedom Observatory of the Brazilian Society for Progress of Science, the SBPC. And to wrap it up, he's a researcher at the Center for Analysis of Freedom and Authoritarianism and focuses his research on the separation of powers, judicial review, constitutional jurisprudence, and the Supreme Court. So now, finally, I will give the floor to our first panelist, Luciano.
Yes, I'm here, Bruno. Thank you so much. So first of all, thank you, Bruno and Peter, for the generous invitation and for entrusting us with this both relevant and delicate topic. I hope we correspond to the expectations. I'm really glad to share this panel with, let me put it this way, my literature, including especially the brilliant Conrado, whose text I've been reading, not only the books, but also the newspaper columns. So our presentation is organized as follows. First, I'll present a broad view on the Brazilian case for the past 4 years or so. And then Manuel is going to present our comparative take on the topic. So I'm going to share the slides. So entitled the presentation, Bolsonaro in the Courts, a comparative perspective. From a broader angle, there are many events that happened over this past period of 4 years. I'm going to divide or split this presentation into two main periods. One coming from the inauguration of the presidency in early 2019 until some point in the mid 2021, which was basically what Matthew Taylor and I addressed in the first online series. So I'm going to recap a bit our take on the topic up until that point, and then I'm going to extend that over the following 18 months until essentially the end of 2022, perhaps, and possibly the beginning of 2023, with the recent dramatic events that I presented in the first slide in the picture. So in these first 30 months, let's put it 30 months of Bolsonaro's administration, we observed essentially two main trends. One was essentially a pattern of accommodation in anti-corruption that involved not only Bolsonaro and his sons and his family, but also a large part of his support base in Congress, as well as various other political actors, essentially looking at the courts as a way to end the courts and the judicial system more broadly, as a way to end and reverse not only the Lava Jato investigations, but also other previous accountability gains over the previous decades. So this involved, of course, this is not limited to what I'm citing here, I'm summarizing grossly, changes in relevant institutions, such as the Prosecutor General in particular, Federal Police, COAF, the Financial Intelligence Unit, which again, we're discussing where to put it, the Revenue Service, and others. A bunch of new laws have been approved, outside the abuse of authority, the Administrative Improv Law, and others, which essentially was the pattern that the Supreme Court itself declared that it wanted to follow in the beginning of 2019, a pattern of accommodation of powers, reversing its previous trend of confrontation in anti-corruption. But at the same time, the presidency did not allow, the president itself did not allow this pattern of accommodation or just accommodation to come by. And in many ways, we all know the various attacks that Bolsonaro and his core supporters performed against the Supreme Court, against specific Supreme Court decisions, against specific Supreme Court justices, and more broadly to the court itself, to the court's role in our democracy, in Brazilian democracy, as well as the various critiques to the electoral system, the electoral courts, the reliability of the the ballot, the electronic ballot, and so on and so forth. At the same time, the Supreme Court did not just sit idle by and self-initiated several criminal inquiries against some of Bolsonaro's core supporters, many of whom arrested, even at least one congressman, Daniel Silveira. And I'd like to highlight that both the attacks by the president to the court and the way in which the court responded, in a way, they were both illiberal, at least in a regular sense, right? They were both potentially harmful to separation of powers to obviously very different degrees. But it's not like the Supreme Court adopted a regular procedure to fight back the attacks it was receiving from the president. So in many ways, it's ironic that the court that was so deferential to due process arguments in anti-corruption during this exact same period was not so receptive of these same arguments when it came to the attacks from the president and his core supporters to defend itself. So in many ways during this period, the Supreme Court received an implicit delegation of powers to act in this way that I just described, illiberally from other powers. But at the same time, the Supreme Court empowered other institutions to deal and eventually to compete and eventually to impose defeats to Bolsonaro. So it granted powers to state governors to fight the pandemic. It mandated a congressional investigation of the federal administration's actions in regard to the pandemic also. And most notoriously, it cleared former President Lula of his corruption convictions, allowing him to run against Bolsonaro in 2022 and eventually defeating him. That said, the Supreme Court not always empower others to deal and compete with Bolsonaro, but especially in one occasion that I recall, it did not do so. And maybe retrospectively, the Supreme Court justices may regret having not done so. They did not allow the former president of the Chamber of Deputies, then Rodrigo Maia, to run for another re-election in 2021. They did not allow that in late 2020, around the same time the so-called secret budget was being installed or created, established, to fund federal resources to create a congressional base for the president. So if you recall, in this early 2021, it was precisely the period in which the pandemic was the most severe. It was precisely in this period in which the president reached its lowest approval ratings. And just maybe, if you can conceive these various scenarios, had the Supreme Court allowed this eventual re-election of Rodrigo Maia, maybe the threat of impeachment could have been more credible. So that being said, I'm going to stop now. I'm going to pass the presentation to Manuel. I'm going to stop sharing my slides so that he can share his, but he takes exactly from the point which he took. Thank you so much so far.
So I'll continue on what Luciano was explaining in terms of the Bolsonaro's government confrontation with the judiciary. And my plan is to do two things. So first, I will contextualize it in comparison to other countries that have been that are also facing democratic backsliding and democratic breakdown in the last 2 decades. And then I will provide a few findings from an ongoing cross-country research project that Luciano and I are doing on the effects, on the consequences of convicting former heads of government for corruption, and the consequences its consequences to encourage and to stimulate the debate and try to so that we can have some ideas of what may happen depending on whether Bolsonaro gets convicted. So how exceptional is Brazil, right? So Luciano was like we are emphasizing, right, showing how much the government has been confronting and attacking the judiciary, right? So in terms of rhetoric, right, in terms of the discourse of the president, the former president himself, and his government, Brazil is a case of very high, very intense attacks on the judiciary, right? And this is true even if we compare other countries where there have been a higher level of democratic backsliding or democratic erosion than in the Brazilian case, right? So Brazil is only comparable to the level of judicial attacks on the judiciary that happened in El Salvador under Bukele in the last few years, right? So he's attacking has been attacking the Salvadorian judiciary quite a lot, and for the case of Poland, right? While other countries in Turkey also had a point in the half of the last decade, right, where Erdogan was also attacking a lot the judiciary there, but in other, so Brazil, it's an example of a place where there has been a high level of attacks on the judiciary, right? And it's not always the case that these attacks are important component of executive overreach, right? Of these ways through which democracies are decaying, right? But it's not always the case that executives decide to do so, right? So if we compare, Brazil faces a very similar trend, right, to the cases of Hungary, Poland, and Turkey to some extent, right, and also Salvador in the last period. So you can see here the line in red is the country's level of democracy, and the line in blue is the level of government's attacks on the judiciary, right? And you can see that these two things go in the opposite ways, right? As more attacks happening to the judiciary, the quality of democracy is decreasing, but you also have different patterns, right, for the cases of India and the Philippines, for example, when these two things do not necessarily move together. So the attacks on the judiciary have been an important part of the reasons why the Brazilian democracy has declined, right? But it's not necessarily the case, and there have been different processes in other countries, right? So to some extent, the Brazilian case is also a case in which the executive, despite all the authoritarian tendencies of the executive, right, they did not manage to reduce the formal powers of the courts, right? And that's something that would be something great to debate later on, and to talk about, like, for the reasons why Brazil. So even though the government was attacking so much, in the end, the former powers, right, at least before another, so because Bolsonaro wasn't reelected, right, we might argue that this was the case, right? But we can see here that despite all the attacks, in Brazil, differently from other countries like El Salvador in the last few years, Hungary for a good part of the last decade, Poland as well, right? Not to talk about Venezuela for a longer period, right? Where the powers of the judiciary, right, to control the arbitrary use of state have been eroded, right? The same did not happen, at least in terms of the formal powers, and then we can talk more about it later in terms of the informal powers that might have been a bit different, right? So in terms of the second part of our presentation, right? So there's a lot of current debate, right, on how whether Bolsonaro should be punished, and for what is he actually going to get to be punished, right, for the kinds of things that he did in government. But Something important to keep in mind, right? I think he was, like, from the point of view of politics, right? He was punished by one of the most powerful tools we have, right? So he did not win despite abusing the powers of the state, right? He did not manage to win re-election, right? So he was already punished. But something really important is, like, whether he will be criminally prosecuted and convicted, right? And especially also in terms of, like, on what grounds will these convictions come from, right? And that's something related to what we are going to show you today, with, like, some findings from our current project, in which we differentiate. So we argue that convictions, and show that the convictions for corruption have different effects. So depending on whether Bolsonaro gets convicted for what his administration did during the pandemic, right, for including the release of fake news, or whether he's convicted for anti-democratic behavior, right, that might have different consequences in comparison to whether if he's convicted for corruption, for example, in the Covaxin case, or in the secret budget scandal. So this is something that Luciano and I have been working for a couple of years now, but we collected data on how heads of government that have been convicted for corruption across the world since the 1940s, right? And so we can see here on this graph, right, the bars in black are represents the number of heads of government that have been convicted for corruption in each decade, right? While the bars in gray represent the number of heads of government that have been convicted for reasons other than corruption, right? You can see this very important increase, right? So we are working on a project to investigate the effects that convicting former heads of government have on things like democracy and judicial independence, right? And we find this in some ways puzzling effect, right? We find this evidence for a backlash when the conviction has to do with corruption, right? We find that after a former head of government is convicted for corruption, right, the system reacts in ways, so there's some backlash that there are negative consequences for democracy, especially in terms of judicial independence, right? So we find that in the 5 years after this conviction, there is a decrease in terms of judicial independence. But we find very different results, right, and that can have consequences for Bolsonaro's different cases, right? We find very different effect if this conviction is not for corruption, right? So heads of government who are convicted for human rights abuses, for political violence, there's more positive effects on the level of democracy than if they're convicted for corruption, right? So these are just some like a summary of an overview of what has happened in these last few years, right? And then these more comparative proposals, just to try to stimulate the debate. But thanks a lot for listening to the presentation.
Thank you so much, Manuel and Luciano, for this kickoff. We will move directly to Conrado's presentation and then to all the discussion.
Okay. Thank you so much, Bruno. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for the organization, for you and Peter. And it was really a privilege to speak here after this very, very insightful presentation by Luciano and Manuel. I don't have slides today, but I want to make a few remarks on how I see, in a more general perspective, the performance of the justice system. And I structured this presentation. I sketched statements, so to say. The first one, I would like, and to some extent, every statement is very related to the other presentations, mainly to the context that Luciano has very well provided. But my first part is an attempt to describe the legal ideological struggle that dominates Brazilian discourse in relation to our central accountability institutions. And I will characterize this legal ideological struggle around a binary and very unproductive, I claim, dichotomy. This dichotomy is lavajatismo on the one side and anti-lavajatismo on the other. Lavajatismo, for those who are not familiar with this word, lavajato or car wash operation was this massive anti-corruption scheme that has made a lot of harm, but anyway, this is a lateral discussion. But I want to characterize what comes from this experience in terms of ideological positions. It has been blurring important debates and producing damaging consequences to how we can think about institutional improvement and reform. It's a very unproductive and to some extent unenlightening dichotomy. So, but this will be my first statement, that I will say a little bit more about that. The second statement, I would like to say a few things echoing what Luciano has said about the Brazilian Supreme Court and resistance, so to say, resistance to Bolsonaro's government. To what extent the Supreme Court resisted, and to what extent it may have collaborated with Bolsonarism, as Luciano has well contended. And finally, I want to sketch or to risk a few words on whether there is a way back to perhaps we can say normality. Normality not in terms of democratic normality, but actually because we are very far from anything that we can call democratic normality, but at least whether there is a way back to, so to say, judicial normality after this storm in which exceptional measures have been taken. So let me start with the first one. And this dichotomy between lavajatismo and anti-lavajatismo, to simplify it, perhaps it's a discussion that explains a lot the omission, the very serious omission of the Brazilian Attorney General, who is the single authority without any sort of appeal, but a single authority with the power to prosecute the president, to promote investigations, criminal investigations against the president. So this ideological struggle, in a way, relates to how people perceive and defend the judicial system is expected to work in its mission against presidential delinquency, so to say, or political delinquency in general. But let me try to characterize both sides of this dichotomy. Lavajatismo is grounded in I would claim a sort of legal philosophy, which can be summarized as follows: is an exceptionalist legal philosophy, and its motto is unique measures to unique circumstances. This phrase, this exact phrase, has been said by the circuit court in the state of Paraná to condone, to accept all the exceptional measures that were taken at that time by Judge Moro. The political strategy of lavajatismo is massive public communication, to enter the public communication battle. The judges and the prosecutors were, they did have a very open and clear communication strategy in order to dispute public opinion and to conquer public support. and they saw themselves as in a very messianic mission. They turned the justice system into an institution that has a sort of mission of saving the country, of cleaning the country against corruption. And of course, in the course of its exercise, there was a lot of abuse of judicial power. These abuses have been described and denounced and perceived since the very beginning, but it became really clear and had produced a huge counterattack when The Intercept, the news outlet, uncovered there was a big leak which is called Vaza Jato. It's a big leak which uncovered communication by telegram between the judge and the prosecutors. The judge and the prosecutors were planning their strategy together, which ended up in the Lula's imprisonment and so on. So in very brief words, this is lavajatismo. The anti-lavajatismo is the reaction, potentialized by lawyers, by organized criminal lawyers that were resisting this. And the motto of anti-lavajatismo is decriminalization of politics. Let's stop saying that anything that politicians do is a crime. So we need to reinforce the legal guarantees, and the guaranteeism is a sort of legal name for due process, etc. So we need to tackle punitivism, and this discourse of decriminalization of politics has become, in some of its, I don't want to generalize here, but in some of its discursive strategies, pretty cynical, because basically it helped publicly justify the gross omission of the Attorney General. So on the one hand, the symbols of lavajatismo is Judge Moro and Prosecutor Deltan Dallagnol. On the other hand, the symbol, the character of anti-lavajatismo, among others, has been the Attorney General himself. And he has been used the legal debate, the technical, perhaps sophisticated legal debate about the legality of both sides have basically disappeared. They have become basically two political positions. These two positions have become very sectarian, and both are deeply pathological and have politicized law in the very specific sense of manipulating the legality discourse for political purpose. They have become sectarian. It's a binary political struggle, and in a way, Brazilian judicial system, especially on the role of the Attorney General, needs to think about reforms and improvement that can escape this binary straitjacket, because both sides are very pathological. We can talk more about about ideas on how to improve this system, but the Bolsonaro's nominated Attorney General has unfolded or has shown a really serious blind spot of the constitutional architecture. So this is my first claim. On the Supreme Court resistance, yeah, it's an important question on how much the Supreme Court has become a resistance trench in the battlefield of autocratization. And before claiming something, I think it's important for those in the audience who are not familiar with the Brazilian constitutional system to say two things. First, what is the Brazilian Supreme Court in terms of its general institutional architecture? It is not at all a traditional constitutional court. It accumulates a large combination of competences that combines the traditional constitutional court, that combines appeals, all sorts of appeals, including appeals that relate to constitutionality. It comprises also criminal competences. So to generalize it, every single legal case, if it manages to raise a constitutional question, can reach, in the end, the Brazilian Supreme Court. And the second contextual claim that I would make, apart from what is the Brazilian Supreme Court, is what type of constitution Brazil has. What type of constitution the Supreme Court is responsible to enforce. It's a very open-ended, transformative constitution, which puts on the shoulders of the justice system a lot of work, and with a large combination of procedural paths through which different political and social actors can reach the Supreme Court. So it was by design a court that was expected to be really flooded from all sides to receive cases. But considering this general context, of course, this is a very formal, preliminary description of it. And in terms of resistance and non-resistance, let me say something about what we can claim on non-resistance. The court, by not resisting Bolsonaro's government, because I think it's important to give a balanced portrait instead of just celebrating the role of the court in terms of resistance, because it has not been so much so. I think a particular feature, procedural feature of the Supreme Court, which is important, it is a very individualistic court. Individual justices, each of the 11 individual justices have a lot of individual power, what we can call monocratic power, to produce decisions by their own. And these decisions, although not being final decisions, in the formal sense, although not being final in the merits, etc., they are procedural decisions. They very often, most often than not, they produce irreversible effects and leaves a lot of way for, on the one hand, obstruction against the court, like it's a sort of veto power, impeding the court to decide on things. And on the other hand, also allows for individual intervention through liminal decisions that actually shakes the political systems as well, without the confirmation of the plenum. So this kind of court gives a lot of obstruction leeway for individual justices to basically postpone, without any limit, cases that are delicate, politically delicate and morally delicate. So I can number a really large group of cases in which the court, either by an implicit collective choice or by an individual veto choice, has sort of avoided very important cases for Brazilian democracy, which were really related to Bolsonarism. And let me just mention 2 or 3 examples. I think cases related to environment and deforestation, the court has done almost nothing. The cases related to the really aggressive attempt of Bolsonaro's government to arm the country through illegal decrees, the court took almost 3 years to overrule a very grossly illegal decree, or a group of decrees, that allowed almost 2 million Brazilians to get illegal arms. So the delay of the court allowed the country, or the Bolsonaro's government, to incentivize a sort of civil army of supporters. And, well, at the very end, they overruled it, but now the reality is created, they are armed. I could mention a few others, but there are a few in human rights which they keep postponing, which produces a huge cost for Brazilian democracy, but they didn't want to confront the government. So this is important to say. In terms of what the court resisted, or arguably resisted, I think they can be organized in 2 main areas. They resisted, in some cases, on the pandemic, on the denialist measures of the government with regards to the sanitary policies, and they also resisted in a very extravagant, innovative, and controversial way in terms of attacks on democracy. I think Luciano has already said quite a bit on this, but let me just say what is this extravagant mode of democracy defense. There is a protagonist to this, an individual protagonist. We cannot overemphasize too much this individual, but he's really important and was creative. He was courageous, arguably, but also this innovation, so to say, comes with risks. This individual is Justice Alexandre de Moraes. He basically, without very clear legal ground, and on the basis of the Attorney General omission, this vacuum that was given by the Attorney General, the court, which is supposed to be inert, which is supposed to act only when is triggered, the court, without being triggered by anyone, created its own criminal inquiry procedure, concentrated the power with Alexandre de Moraes. This has become a sort of informal institution inside the court to administer and respond to attacks made by Bolsonaro. So in a very delicate and strategic way, whenever Bolsonaro was attacking the court, something really serious in terms of investigative measures was taken by Alexandre de Moraes. This is a very interesting institutional experience, and also to some extent worrisome, because arguably the due process standards were very relaxed, so to say. New standards were applied, and on the one hand, this is controversial and worrisome, but at the same time, one cannot say it did not work to some extent to tackle this very new mode of political delinquency, which is connected mainly with technology platforms, which potentialize the dissemination of fake news, help coordinate attacks, collective attacks, etc. The institutions were not prepared, and something very creative, innovative, and perhaps needs to be corrected at some point, but something was created that arguably has worked. Perhaps not enough, but it has worked. Just one more component. The Brazilian justice system has an electoral court system. The electoral justice system is the system which organizes the election and also provides the accountability structure for the election. And for a historical coincidence, the same very courageous justice that was conducting the criminal inquiry in the STF, he has become at the same time, this is how it is designed, he has become at the same time the president of the electoral court. This allowed him to somehow triangulate the powers that he accumulated in the Supreme Court and the powers that he had in the electoral court. And again, deciding very rapidly, very swiftly on both jurisdictions. And this was very, very important for conducting the elections, because the amount of abuse of power, economic power and political power and governmental power that Bolsonaro's government has put into the election has made Lula's victory almost a miracle. So yeah, this is what I wanted to say. And let me just say something on one slide of Manuel, the particular slide whether Bolsonaro should be punished. I would suggest including there, because the slide says, well, he was already punished in the election, and that's, in terms of electoral accountability, that's perfectly right. And then you mention, well, but should he be criminally prosecuted? And then you mention the pandemic, the fake news, the anti-democracy, and the corruption. I would add a third category, because he can be punished by electoral courts. This is not properly so called. This is not criminally. This is not common crime. It's electoral crime. And actually, when we consider nowadays the likelihood of Bolsonaro being punished, the most likely, let's see how it goes, but the most likely is that he becomes punished by the electoral court. And this punishment can be very consequential, because it basically takes Bolsonaro out of the political game, even if he doesn't go to jail and so on. But taking him out of the political game is really perhaps one of the most consequential sanctions that he can suffer. But I'll stop here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Conrado. Now, following a tradition at USP University, I would first ask the students now participating in the Ipsos Summer School to ask some questions.
There is one already, Bruno.
Okay.
So hello, everybody. I'm Gabriela. I'm a master's student here at USP. Hello, Luciano and Manuel. It's a great pleasure attending your talk. So I have two questions, actually. The first one is for the first project, and the second one is for Conrado. So first, well, Luciano knows how I am a big fan of this current project. You and Manuel are working. And actually, my question is hopefully an invitation for you to talk more about it. So my question is about the mechanisms of, or possible mechanisms that are behind the scenes, right? So why are you finding these unintended effects of corruption conviction on democracy or judicial independence? And I was actually thinking about the Brazilian case and car wash, because if we think about what's happening right here and about the facts and events that Conrado and Luciano talked about, I would say that Lava Jato is a great, or has been in the last two electoral cycles at least, a great asset for political competitors, right? So it's kind of a flag that you can say about your opponents. And in this sense, we could expect that 5 years after a presidential conviction, maybe we will see no effect on threats on judicial independence, since it's my interest that my opponents get punished and so on. On the other hand, we could advocate for an alternative hypothesis that maybe it's not at all for politicians something that interests them to have like a strong judiciary and corruption accountability against all of them. So I would like to ask if have you advanced on these possible mechanisms, or what do you think is happening, or how could we try to interpret that? I would love to hear that from you. So this is my first question. The second one is about Conrado claim that our court is very individualistic, and this is a strong argument. You have like you all are my bibliography, so I'm super suspect of talking about that. But I would ask about this current cycle that you were all talking about, because something that you have seen is, of course, Alexandre de Moraes and others ministers like acting in an individually way, but we have also watched the court referendum that, like confirming these individual strategies. Also in the inquéritos, like the self-created ones, but also recently, like last week, on these removals, temporary removals from office. So I would like to listen about you, like from you, what do you think? Like maybe in this case, is it a self-protecting collective strategy, or is it something that like costs more for the judges to reverse an individual justice in this context, and this is why they are not doing that? Or do they agree maybe with this strategy? And that's all. Thank you.
I can go, and then maybe Manuel complements my arguments. So I'm not trying to make this too long, okay, Gabriela, because the discussion is mostly about Bolsonaro and not so much about corruption convictions. So we're still struggling with identifying mechanisms, of course. This is an ongoing project. So we could conceive at least 3 different types of mechanisms so far. The first is the regular type backlash mechanism. The new government comes to power and attempts to curb the investigations or previous judicial efforts as a way to save itself. Okay, so it's the regular description. A second way through which judicial independence may be reduced is essentially the kick in the stairs argument. So if corruption convictions help to accelerate the pace of political competition by removing contenders, as I become the new incumbent, I don't want these mechanisms to work against myself. Okay? And a third different mechanism is essentially weaponizing the judicial system against my opponents. So this may be a combination of the previous 2, of course, right? So if I came to power helped by an anti-corruption surge, I may now use this anti-corruption system to go after my political opponents, okay? That's it. Manuel, if you have any different thoughts, please go ahead.
For the question, Gabriel, I think that's, yeah, definitely we are working on these mechanisms, and it's related. Like if we look across the world in terms of like anti-establishment presidents or outsiders or people at least claiming that they will, you know, be anti-corruption candidates, right? That's something that we see this pattern in, and we're also doing some more case studies, including some cases in Latin America, to investigate these more deeply. But I think I completely agree with your intuition in terms of the political competition and the use of these investigations against other politicians. So yeah, thanks a lot for that.
Gabriela, thank you so much for your question, and it's good that you problematized my general statement that the court is very individualistic, because it can be qualified, or much better qualified than I was able to do. And one important qualification relates, as you mentioned, to this massive criminal inquiry procedure that was created in the office of Alexandre de Moraes, and it is very true that there is a very clear deference from the court and from the plenum to what Alexandre de Moraes is doing monocratically, both in the Supreme Court and in the Electoral Court. And usually the court has been quite quick to formally confirm, and I perceive it as a way, as a survival mode, because finally the court has been realizing that individual decisions are weak. They tend to be perceived as personalistic, as and in this sense to be more vulnerable to capture or to being politicized. And this criticism against STF individualism dates back at the very least for 10 or 15 years, people observing the court and studying the court, much before the, so to say, democratic crisis and clear attacks on the court. When we were supposedly living democratic normality, this was already very, very problematic and very normalized. And we were already saying, well, when things become harder, you have much less conditions of facing the challenges that constitutional courts are supposed to face in times of crisis. And that actually ended up happening. There is another movement that there is a sort of trend trying to de-individualize the court. I would mention two other variables. the court created what we call the virtual plenum, which is a possibility of the judges voting or putting them votes together without an open session with discussion, but basically in just a few days putting their votes into the system and producing decision quite quickly. This has slightly created incentives for reducing individuality, and the most important decision has been taken in the very end of December, before the court went to vacation. They approved a resolution that tries, let's see how it works, because it starts working next month, that tries to limit the individual power to obstruct, as we call the pedido de vista, the claim for the justices to, well, let me wait a bit more, I need to think more, so let me take this case home. And this particular mechanism, as you know, has no accountability mechanism. So some justices, and this is not exceptional, this has become normality, took years to bring back the case. This particular mechanism is trying to be controlled. I'm not the most optimistic person in terms of the reliability of formal norms produced by the court itself to regulate the justices' behavior, because there was already, before this new resolution, there was already an attempt to regulate the deadlines for justice to bring back the case. And these deadlines were never respected. So there is a sort of complicity, a reciprocity among all the justices, because they all benefit from this non-compliance with their internal rules. So yes, that's more or less, it remains very individualistic. There is a trend to less individualistic posture, but let's see how it develops in the next few months.
Thank you. So do you have a second question from the students? Yes.
Well, I would thank you all for your presentation. My question would be more to Conrado, but it can be generalized. I would like to ask if this exemption time or time of exception where Alexandre de Moraes has single-handedly and very swiftly decided and ruled over decisions of other powers. And I do agree with the necessity, because it's the time of exception, and we all agree that fake news and direct coup attempts, they attack the democracy. But I would like to ask whether this is not like an opportunity to open a Pandora box and for other justices or other ministers to actually single-handedly rule over other powers' decisions, and that can actually damage the democracy in general. I can give an example. Last year, the Congress passed a bill to set a wage ceiling for so wage floor actually for the nurses, and Justice Barroso overruled the Congress decision, claiming that it was irrational on economic terms. And while we can agree on that theoretically, it is a congressional ability, and is a part of democracy actually to attend interest groups and redistributive policies. So my question is actually whether these overreach is just a time of exception, or this individualistic behavior can also damage other parts of democracy, not only to protect it.
Okay, thank you. And who would like to answer? Luciano, Manuel, Conrado?
I can jump first and allow Conrado to think of a better answer later. So, thanks, João, for your question. Okay, I didn't thank Gabriela first, so I'm thanking her now again. So the problem relies, of course, in knowing whether or not, or especially who defines what are the exceptional times, of course. So this is the Schmidian dilemma. to many extent, right? And in many ways, as I was listening to Conrado's presentation, the rhetoric of lavajatism resembles in many ways the rhetoric that has allowed Alexandre de Moraes to perform its powers more recently. So exceptional times or circumstances demand exceptional measures. So we're operating, the judicial system in Brazil has been operating through a logic of exceptionalism for almost a decade now. So, which is, well, the Pandora's box was already open in a way, and Alexandre de Moraes just grabbed it and maybe amped it because he's at the Supreme Court. So in many ways, yes, this is a Pandora's box that we may have to get used to it over time. But at the same time, I'll remember that this is not as individualistic as it seems. So I'll go back to Conrado's answer to Gabriela. To a large extent, Alexandre de Moraes' actions were either implicitly and several times explicitly a delegation from the other justices and even other branches, I would say, to the Supreme Court. So to a large extent, or to some extent at least, there is a dynamic here which I may have not explained later. Something happens in 2021, which is the change in the presidency of the Chamber of Deputies. And in many ways, this removes one barrier to Bolsonaro's most authoritarian efforts. So essentially now, the Chamber of Deputies is no longer a problem. It's just the Senate and the Supreme Court. So we can now see that both Bolsonaro and the Supreme Court amped their games over 2021 and especially 2022. So essentially the problem about whether or not we're opening a Pandora's box will rely on the level of delegation that the Supreme Court may give to its justices, and a second order delegation, whether or not Congress will allow more generally the courts to behave like this. It has allowed, right? Even in cases that have attacked congressmen such as Daniel Silveira, right? So there was some degree of delegation. The question is whether or not the court and Congress will allow these powers to be used in the future against other potential opponents, and not only Bolsonaro. And the decision to try to make the decision-making more collegiate may have to do something about it. Of course, we have to investigate, but maybe it has to do something about it. So now that the exceptionalism is getting over, we may need to establish more normal rules, if there is such a thing. Did I give you time, Conrado, to think of or Manuel, or to think of better answer, guys? I don't know. Go ahead, please.
Let me say something additional to Luciano's, and I think, João, you are right. You are right to point to the risks of what is happening. That there is a lot of risk of where this is going, and this was actually what I promised to be the third part of my initial presentation, but I was already talking too much, and I forgot to finish it. And I was basically there. I wanted to raise this question of when and how should the judicial system go back to democratic normality, as I said. One thing we can know is that, well, it won't come back on its own without collaboration and political articulation of other branches. So this is one first statement. It won't come back as long as the risk, well, at least in principle, as long as the risks and the attacks on democracy remain in this huge vacuum, both institutional vacuum because the Attorney General is not acting, and the regulatory vacuum in which there is no legislation, there is no particular agency to deal with this information. They are just, these platforms are incentivizing really complicated behavior. So I wouldn't expect, at least as long as Alexandre de Moraes is there, I wouldn't expect the court to recede. But another thing that I'd like to say, João, is that I wouldn't mix, as you did, very different types of cases. One thing is the ordinary constitutionality cases, the example of the nurse floor salary, in which you very rightly can see the Barroso's decision is absurd, arbitrary, dilettantish, etc. This is really, you're right, this damages democracy, but this is sort of an ordinary problem of constitutional review. Perhaps the incompetence of our constitutional justices to provide good constitutional arguments when they practice this really strong power is something to be discussed. But I think this is very different from this very extraordinary case of attacks on democracy. Here, the court is really acting on a survival mode. And I think the court has a risk of underreacting or overreacting. And it chose to run the risk of overreacting. This is risky, but and it demands a lot of, so to say, legal innovation. Legal innovation is a sort of euphemistic way to say that, well, some legal standards are not being respected here. Let's see how much they can be justified, even if they are new, on the basis of legal principles. But I wouldn't overemphasize this criticism. That there is no one being punished by these innovative measures, because the court itself needs the Attorney General to punish anyone criminally. What is happening, and this must be taken seriously, is these liminal measures, investigative measures. Some persons are being taken to prison not because of a criminal conviction, but in order for facilitating investigation, etc. Of course, abuse can be made there. There is no blank check to the court, and we shouldn't do that. But I think the only point I would make here, I think we should take very seriously the extraordinary nature of the moment, the extraordinary power of these new instruments, and the absolute lack of institutional infrastructure to tackle them. It has been arguably successful to some extent, not enough. These technologies are still able to organize what happened on January 8th. YouTube, Telegram, and etc. have been a powerful instrument to allow these people to do what they did in January 8th. But we are in a zone of a risky zone. You're right to be concerned, and when it will be possible to come back, it's an open question.
Okay, let's give our online participants a chance to pose questions. I would like to start with one, and then Andrea. I would like to just connect the contributions of our three panelists and make use of what Conrado said about the accumulation of power. I cannot frame, or I'm not used to frame my questions in terms of abuse. I do not have enough legal training. So I'm thinking about a political scientist where institutions can accumulate power. That is one problem, or can lose power and independence to other. That's the other problem. So making use of what Conrado said, I'm asking Manuel and Luciano. Their Y scale, their graphs started at a 0 for probably total independence or an imaginary independence of the judiciary, and then a lack of an increasing lack of independence when it comes to 1, 2, 3. And my question is if Conrado's comments do not demand a scale that goes in both directions. So shouldn't you evaluate both the fact or the events that threaten judicial independence because the government intervenes and it cuts back the budget or any kind of influence that limits judicial independence. But on the other side, shouldn't you also include at the same scale the trend to overreach or over accumulate powers, which we also see and which Conrado characterized as the same problem seen from the other side? So that's my question to Luciano and Manuel. And then we can move on to Andrea.
All right, so thank you very much. And I have a question that I think is for both of us. When you were talking about punishment and Bolsonaro, so my question is that if you could say something about punishment of Bolsonaristas in a very peculiar aspect, I believe, but you will tell me better about it, about the Brazilian Constitution, which is the military justice. So, of course, we are focusing a lot on the judiciary, well, the civil judiciary system. So my question is that enough actually to deal with the problem we have in Brazil, to the extent that Bolsonaristas are much more than Bolsonaro, and if he's even punished in the worst cases possible? I mean, we still have Bolsonaristas, and a lot of them are military that are actually entitled to be punished in the military justice. So if you could say something about that. Thank you.
Okay, now. Oh, sorry, Matthew.
I'll
Okay,
be quick.
let's take Matthew.
I'll be quick. Just two more comments than questions. But first of all, I thought Gabriela had a very good question about the mechanisms for Luciano and Manuel. And I would make it a little more complicated by asking you to think about the mechanisms, not just in terms of either judicial independence or democracy, but the mechanisms that that run between them. Because I think your responses are really about the mechanisms that affect judicial independence, but I think that the bigger contribution might be to think about the larger relationship there. And then for Conrado, this is totally unfair, but I know he's up to it. I think, you know, what you're describing from the lens of a political scientist sounds like a trap, where the incentives for exceptionalism, for casuismo, are very high. The incentives for legal innovation and exceptionalism. And, you know, a trap is one in which all actors have a reason to revert to the worst possible behavior. And it seems to me that in many ways, that's what we're seeing here. And we've been seeing it starting with Lava Jato and maybe even before, and carrying through to the present. And I just wonder, you know, if it's possible to think of examples where that kind of a trap has been broken, where the downward cycle has been broken, and what would be the way to do that, particularly because, as you said earlier, the system serves the elite, the political elite, as it functions. At least that's what I understood you saying. And so the incentives are there for the system to stay in place. How do you break it? And thank you for the organization of this, Bruno, and everyone else.
So these are all easy questions. Luciano.
Really easy. So thank you for the easy questions, guys. I think in many ways you're correct. I'm trying to connect everything here, so to be quick and give some more space for Manuel to reply, especially on the measurement. In many ways, yes, there are other measures that attempt to capture, identify not only the independence, but also eventually corruption by the judiciary, right? So corruption of the judiciary may be what we understand as judicial overreach, even though it's not as clear as we may have wanted these measures to exist. For the most time, I don't think they exist. A measure of judicial overreach, because it is assumed for the most time the judiciary is mostly a victim rather than an aggressor. Okay, so it's most measures assume that. Okay, yeah, precisely, right. So don't shoot the messenger. I'm just replying what these guys usually measure. But I agree entirely, right? So we have to come up with some sort of measure of judicial overreach, judicial abuse. I don't know exactly how to frame this. This includes and may not be limited to how we understand the court's role for the democracy, right? So, which is then going to Matthew's question. In a way, Matthew, what Manuel and I are doing, it's interesting that you asked, because the first version of the paper we're working on right now, I'm gonna put the blame on me. So Manuel's idea was to take this leap and discuss the consequences for democracy more generally, depending on the different types of convictions, whether for corruption or for other reasons. And my initial take was to, in many ways, to make it smaller, the paper, and discuss only the consequences for judicial independence, and then a second paper for the discussion on liberal democracy more generally. But indeed, right, so this goes back in a way to what Bruno said. If the courts overreach, maybe they're too independent, right? Independent to the point of being corrupt, independent to the point of doing whatever they want, independent to the point of, to use Glenn Greenwald's recent tweets, a dictatorship of the judiciary, right? So, of course, no one wants that. And the consequences of an overly independent court system is the fact that they are harmful to democracy. And in many ways, I think the problem we have here is that the name of the variable we want to capture is not independence, but impartiality, right? So we want the courts to be impartial, and being independent, organizing them as independent, is the way you usually conceive for the courts to be impartial. But being independent actually is just, you know, an empty vessel in a way, right? For different sorts of interests. The court can be independent and do whatever it wants. So in many ways, the questions we want to answer, they regard the impartiality of the court system, and this goes in a way to what Andrea was asking about the military courts. And honestly, Andrea, I have no answers about that. In many ways, Manuel and I are trying to come up with how trying to understand is how civilian courts punish heads of government, even former military officials. Say Argentina, 1985, the movie, right? So frankly, I don't know. And again, this will depend less on how the courts properly work and more how the political system delegates to civilian courts to act in this way, eventually to strip powers from military courts to do so. Because honestly, I don't see military courts punishing anyone or imposing real punishment to any military involved with Bolsonarismo. Okay, I talked too much. Sorry, Manuel, please enlighten me.
No, I think that Luciano had really good replies to the questions, even though like the questions were quite challenging. And so in terms of like Bruno's point about the measurement, right? So something that I would add was like that the vast majority, this like, you know, one of the things of doing these things cross-nationally, right? For all countries, we have something like 70 countries that have convicted their former heads of government, right? So we're doing, and the vast majority is like does not have a super high level of independence, right? Or the judicial independence in terms. So we're not really at a point where they're considering, given though like all the things that Luciano mentioned about, like, of course, we're concerned about judicial overreach and all these things, but it really seems to be that like in most cases, it's actually it's actually the opposite, right? So we see this like reaction after the conviction. You have this window of opportunity to like successive leaders and to the political class to reach an agreement and say and try to like strip powers away from the judiciary after these convictions happened. Maybe because they are like myopic, that they didn't realize it was going so too far, that it could come back against them, their interests, right? But it could be also that, you know, they're doing this for right reasons, even though I would say that it's probably not in the majority of the cases. So the vast majorities of these convictions take place in emerging democracies, right? So countries that are not, they are somewhat, they are democratic, but not very much so. And yeah, so yeah, I think I'll leave to the experts in the room to answer the other questions.
Let me try to answer both Andrea and Matthew. Andrea, you're very right to make the distinction between Bolsonaristas and military Bolsonaristas, because the attempt to punish them, to prosecute them, is very different. Basically, military will be probably, there is a legal discussion there, and we still have to face it, but they will probably be should be prosecuted by the military courts. And the military courts, or even if we cannot claim that this is very uniquely Brazilian, it is quite unique to keep military courts in a democracy with the kind of jurisdiction that these military courts have. The Supreme Court itself has already had the opportunity and still have pending cases on deciding the precise limits of this jurisdiction. And the Supreme Court has usually been very deferential to very expensive military courts jurisdiction. The basic problem is because the crimes that military might have committed on Sunday, January 8th, the relationship between the criminal code and the military criminal code works as this. As long as the military committed a crime that can be both a common crime in the general criminal code and also a military crime, then the military crime prevails and it attracts the military courts. When it is not described by the military criminal code, but it is described by the criminal general code, then they can be prosecuted by the general civil courts. And so the point is that the crimes that are there in the military code are, some of them are use quite general terms, and they can definitely be claimed to prevail and to be the crimes that arguably the military committed on that Sunday. So there are legal arguments which will probably be used in case we reach that point of an attempt for prosecution. This is already quite optimistic, to actually come to the point in which they will be prosecuted. And if we come to that point, there is another challenge, which is, well, will they be prosecuted by the military or by the civil court? Very likely there will be strong movement for them to be prosecuted, if we reach that point, by the military court. In terms of general Bolsonaristas, I think that the main problem there, again, is well, so far it has been the omission by the Attorney General. But as long as these Bolsonaristas are not in power anymore, those who are not in power anymore, they lose this sort of privilege of being prosecuted only by the very top jurisdiction. So from now on, they can be prosecuted in the first instance. And Bolsonaro himself can arguably be prosecuted by the first instance. But it remains to be seen, because there is a decisive choice to be made by the Supreme Court, which will actually define whether it is true that they will be prosecuted by the first instance. Because Alexandre de Moraes, who has been described as a sort of heroic person in Brazilian democracy, he himself can say that, well, no, our criminal inquiry already involves Bolsonaro, so everything that relates to Bolsonaro, you remain in court, in the Supreme Court. This decision has still not been made, but we are waiting for checking what path the Supreme Court will allow to be taken in terms of prosecuting Bolsonaro himself. This is possible for that the Supreme Court will keep the jurisdiction, and this will be terrible, I think. And again, this connects to Matthew's really difficult point, and Luciano has also captured it, that there is a sort of exceptionalist discourse that was already present in lavajatismo, and I don't happen to have an example, as Matthew has asked, where the trap has been broken, because these elite institutions will never, without proper political conditions, will not by themselves just step back. And I think this is right. I can imagine a situation in which the Congress will try to step in and try to define more clearly through legislative innovation what the court can do. Although there is a affinity between lavajatismo and the defense of democracy, I think the exercise of drawing distinctions between one and the other, because I would claim, as at the top of my head, that lavajatismo went much farther away. It is too early, I think, to equate both things, although both resort to an exceptionalist sort of justification. I think it is too early and risky to equate both things. I think that the defense of democracy mode is still doing very, very basic things on the ground of investigation, etc. The criminal inquiry actually is very much related to the omission of the Attorney General. So with a new Attorney General, and depending on what Congress wants to do with that, I can imagine a scenario in which the court will try to reaccommodate itself. But it's a nice question to have. I'll think much more about it.
Okay, so should we call it a day? I mean, this is really an endless. I hope the dust settles, at least in terms of us being presented with new facts and being able to reflect in a more calm way and write our papers on this topic in the course of the next few weeks. Okay, thank you so much for participating. And next week, in a week from now, we will have our last session on Bolsonaro and foreign politics and international relations. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Luciano, Manuel,
Thank you, guys.
Bruno,
Thank you,
Matthew,
Conrado.
Andrea.
Bruno.
Ciao.